Chevron load shedding from 1800 network sucks. Okay. Guys, we have a fair amount to get through. So I will not spend too long on They Call You Mr. Steve Biko because it's not one of your set poems. I just find that it's a good way to speak about the use of repetition, anaphora and epistrophe in poetry, and then we can have a look at Say No, as well as I Rise. So just doing a little bit of a sound check to see if everybody can hear me correctly, or clearly at least. Cool, thanks. Bridget, yeah, I load shed at 8, so we'll get through what we can get through up until then, and then yeah, we'll move on next week. Next week will be the last session I have just for a week because I'm away in the Drakensberg the following week. So we'll take a week's break during assessment week, but we'll do something on Thursday next to make sure that there's a little bit more ground covered. Okay, so just give me an idea if anybody's read this poem before or heard of this poem before. All right. So this poem would most likely be defined as an elegy. An elegy is a type of poem that is dedicated to somebody after their death, like a eulogy, and it, for me, falls into the realm of resistance poetry quite neatly. So it's not, as I say, one of our set poems, but just has this lovely use of repetition that we see throughout many of the resistance poems that we do. So I'm going to go ahead and read it. If you need to zoom in on your screen, please do. So I want you to pay attention to the way it's written, the use of the punctuation, the use of grammar in the poem itself. Excuse me. They call you Mr. Steve Biko. Now you're dead. And though your death may leave them cold, they who tormented you when you were alive call you Mr. Steve Biko. Now you're dead. So many garlands others have placed around your neck, around your neck. You've been given coverage the size of a rugby field. Now you're dead, but you're dead. The best advocate in the land was your voice, And what does it matter what was said at an inquest? The best advocates in the land may speak for the dead, but they're dead. They call you Mr. Steve Biko. Now you're dead. And though your death may leave them cold, they who tormented you when you were alive call you Mr. Steve Biko. Now you're dead. Right. I assume that many of you, if not most of you, will know who Steve Biko was. Yes, no? Okay. Good. Okay, so many of you will know that he died in police custody, and there was a flurry of messaging after his death to try and define what had happened, that he died accidentally, that he slipped and fell down some stairs, he slipped and fell out of a window, he slipped and hit his head. There were all these kind of conflicting messages as to what happened to him. And I find it an interesting poem to actually look at this week, especially because of what's happening in Iran at the moment, where the young lady, I'm afraid her name slips my mind, but over the weekend was detained in police custody for not wearing her hijab. And very shortly after that, an ambulance was called because apparently she had had a heart attack in police custody during her quote unquote re-education about morality and values. So there's a lot of protest action happening in Iran at the moment. Women are burning their hijabs, they're cutting their hair short. There are riot police out, people are throwing rocks and petrol bombs at the police. It's just this really strong reaction to what happened to her. It's very hard for many people to believe that a otherwise healthy 22-year-old woman would suddenly have a heart attack in police custody when they'd taken her forcibly off the street to re-educate her about wearing traditional clothing. So I find that, as I said, it's a little bit sadly coincidental that this is where we start this week. So Have a look, please, at the way that Steve Biko's name is written in the poem. Tell me if there's anything that stands out as interesting to you there. Right. So why has he chosen to use lowercase for the name of a leader of the Black consciousness movement who's dead or who has died? Yeah, it's kind of a false respect. He's identifying the false respect that's applied to Steve Biko after his death. The obviously the name Steve Biko and Mr. Steve Biko should be in capital letters as proper respect, and he's mocking the government for calling him Mr. Steve Biko only once he's dead, an enemy of the state before he's taken into police custody, and all of a sudden they're applying this kind of pseudo respect to him now that they've accidentally killed him in police custody and have to deal with the aftermath. Carry on, yeah. No real respect. It's like lip service, I think is the right term that the government would have paid him. I make the point that if you think about apartheid era South Africa and the minority rule, the ratio of white to non-white citizens or members of the South African public is massively outweighed against the white population. So when the government takes into custody somebody like Steve Biko and accidentally kills him, they are crapping themselves that this is going to be something that starts the mass of the population reacting in a violent fashion. So there is this kind of pseudo-respectful response to the life of Steve Biko by government in order to try and placate the population and hope that they don't rise up. So this may leave them cold, may leave them cold. At the beginning of a line, if you have repetition occurring at the beginning of lines, it's called anaphora. If you have it occurring at the end of the line, it's called epistrophe. And technically speaking, you have them both in this line, even though it is the exact same phrase that's used. You'll note that in each stanza, there's a repetition of something he wants you to think about, that there's a double meaning to each one. I want to say it was P.W. Botha. I cannot be absolutely certain, but he made the statement when he heard of the death of Steve Biko in police custody, "Did not make coat. It leaves me cold." And I think that the poets used the phrase twice because obviously when the government realizes that, hang on, we've killed somebody who is a very potent leader of the Black consciousness movement, you can imagine this chill running down their spine, like, oh God, what now? What's going to happen now? That leaves me cold. And this repetition of it may leave them cold. For me, implies this kind of false sense of sympathy and this false sense of sorrow for the loss of Steve Biko. That in fact, it leaves them cold as an emotionless. They who tormented you when you were alive call you Mr. Steve Biko. Now you're dead. So they only pay you respect once you're dead. So that repetition of the line at the beginning and the end of the stanza, and then in the last stanza, the entire first stanza is repeated for effect as well. So many garlands others have placed around your neck, around your neck. In the second stanza, this repeated form here, where we have this phrase repeated twice. I want to ask you guys if you can draw any kind of conclusions as to what the phrase around your neck might mean. Does the cold not rather refer to fear than emotionless? So, Jean, sorry, I forget how to pronounce it. I think in the first instance, that leaves me cold. Yes, that's a statement of fear. Oh, like they're going, oh shit, oh no. And then the second use of the repetition by the poet maybe mocks their public statement of black sorrow. That in fact they're actually just being cold, like emotionless. Okay, thank you, Lou. Jimmy Kruger. Okay, so what are the potential implications of the repeated phrase around your neck, around your neck. Cast your mind back to apartheid era South Africa, and those of you who weren't alive then or weren't aware then, any idea what it might imply? Aha! Okay, that's my first, my first image that jumps to mind is necklacing. Okay. For those of you who don't know what necklacing is, it's still practiced today, sadly. Maybe not as publicly or publicized as much as it used to be, but it was the treatment for people who, impimpi, I think is the right word, somebody who was an informant, would be publicly executed by placing a tire over their neck and shoulders, filling it with fuel and setting it on fire. The other potential, Eustace, don't do that. Don't do that, Lou. I wonder if anybody else will get the joke. Dark humor. Okay. The other potential implication for me of around your neck, when he set up this image of garlands of flowers being placed around somebody's neck, it's a way of celebrating a person, a way of acknowledging them and showing them respect. But then he has this double use of around your neck afterwards, where when the death penalty was in play, we used to hang people instead of the electric chair or the lethal injection. So I think there's a slight implication of this fact that they would have actually just strangled him or hung him, and that they maybe actually did kill him like that. Okay, you've been given coverage the size of a rugby field. Now you're dead, but you're dead. So the pseudo-state funeral that he gets, the publicity that he gets for the funeral as placatory measures that the government allows in order to keep the population or his supporters at least a little bit quelled. But he recognizes the irony in it. You get this coverage, finally, you get the kind of the stage upon which to speak, but you're dead. It's too late. The best advocate in the land was your voice, That's quite sad. So we're speaking about people who potentially in the first place might have, at the inquest into his death, spoken on his behalf or spoken against the state. That he's saying the best advocate in the land was your voice. You were the best voice to hear. You were the loudest, the most powerful voice to hear. And then this repetition was your voice. This past tense notion that it's silenced forever. And what does it matter what was said at an inquest? The best advocates in the land may speak for the dead, but they're dead. But a sad and solemn acknowledgement that when it comes to finding out what happened to him, you're not going to be able to bring him back. You're not going to be able to give him justice. And I think can the rugby field possibly refer to the hospital named after him? Possibly, and I'm not entirely sure. You can do your own research and find out for us while we go through them if you're okay with it. I think the hospital field, the hospital will be post-apartheid most likely. But that's an educated guess. Where was I? Okay, so you'll see once again that the entire first stanza is repeated. The use of this lowercase Mr. Steve Biko is emphasized again. And this may leave them cold, This repetition of the idea that there's this false messaging happening, this idea that we're paying respects to somebody only because if we don't, that it is likely to result in a degree of resistance or protest, and the government just can't have that when they've made their mistake, this kind of shallow attempt to put out the fire that they potentially started. So I love the way it's so simple and it's quite interpretive, but there's a lot of contextual imagery. So like around your neck, around your neck. The kind of suggestion that puts forth is something that a South African will understand, but not necessarily somebody from outside of the country. And by doubling up these statements, this use of repetition, Barnaby has really done something quite simple and effective by implying that there's two meanings to these sort of statements. There's two meanings that can be taken from these actions. And I think it's very simple, straightforward, and quite effective. Okay, so my point in using this as a kickoff poem is just that it shows a very effective yet simplistic use of repetition in poetry. Yeah. It also shows a way that the poet has used just the grammar and the grammatical rules that usually apply, the standardized grammatical rules that usually apply to writing, and has done away with them in order to make a very effective statement, simply by lowercasing the M, the S, and the B in Mr. Steve Biko, can infer a lot, that it's sort of false respect. And he doesn't need to explain that. He can just write it like that and leave it in our hands to make our assumptions. And I love the fact that the poem is simple, yet that effective for me. I've looked at this poem for close on 6 years, it's 5 years now, and it's never lost its impact for me. Okay, so Barnaby gives us an example of using repetition in poetry for effect. He has created double meaning in the duplicate use of phrases and leaves it up to his audience to infer meaning or imply meaning. So I'm going to quickly find my next one. So I asked you guys to have a look at Say No. Who, out of interest, just give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down, managed to engage with Say No? To Megan Grace, Jan, Hunter. Okay, can I get some opinions on this poem, what they thought of it? Please use your mic if you can. It's a lot quicker than typing. Okay. All right, so another resistance poem based in the apartheid era and set against the backdrop of resistance against apartheid. The way she uses her repetition is different. It creates for me a chanting tone. Now, I'm going to do my best to read it in the way that I think it was written. I'll ask you to bear with me, but I think that the poem needs to be heard, not read. So, Say No by Cleveland Florby. Say no, black woman, say no. When they call your jobless son a tsotsi, say no. Say no, black woman, say no. When they call your husband at the age of 60 a boy, say no. Say no, black woman, say no. When they rape your daughter in detention and call her a whore, say no. Say no, black woman, say no. When they call your white sister a madam, say no. Say no, black woman, say no. When they call your white brother a boss, say no. Say no, black woman, say no. When they call a trade unionist a terrorist. Say no, black woman, say no. When they give you a back seat in the liberation, say no. Yes, black woman, a big no. So if you read it like that, if you read it at that pace and at that rhythm, thanks. If you're wondering what the clapping sound is, for some reason I'm slapping my neck. I don't know why that works, but it feels good. So, what does it sound like? What can you see in your mind when you hear something like this? Say no, black woman, say no. Yeah. Okay, protest. Think of people marching down the street, holding placards, chanting, say no, black woman, say no. The physical act of poetry for me is the physical act of resistance and protest is invoked in that very simple repetition. It's got this rhythm to it, this quality, and every time it's introduced, she gets to speak about a different aspect of her resistance, a different theme of her resistance. A chant, as you said, yeah. So I'd like to just kind of unpack some of the imagery in each of the stanzas, and then we can just talk about her use of the effectiveness of her use of repetition. So in the first stanza, you'll see, say no when they call your jobless son a tsotsi. Does anybody know what a tsotsi is? Gangster, thug, criminal, thief, and no good. I think that Mhlophe is very well aware of the power of language, obviously as a poet, but the power of language in the apartheid system. Yes, because I had to read the book. So one of the things that I've thought long and hard about is how, just as part of my life, how during several hundred years of colonial power in South Africa, and then the arguably 40 years worth of apartheid, how do you keep people from rising up when they outnumber you so severely that it wouldn't take much to do so? And I think there are many, many structures in place, but one of the most important methods in order to keep people downtrodden, broken down, weakened, is to force them to understand themselves in a language that you decide. So not in actual language, but using words of power. So we're all aware of some of the very significant, hurtful words in our own historical past, but there's something much more insidious in the way people are languaged by virtue of their role in society. So when she says, when they call you a jobless son, a tsotsi, to repeat the message over and over that, oh, if you're not working, you must be a criminal, and therefore we're going to treat you like a criminal. It's not to say that it causes somebody to become a criminal, but it can cause them to question their own value, can cause them to question who they are in terms of their role in society. And if that happens on multiple occasions across a generational grouping, those people who have the downtrodden kind of self-esteem because of the way they've been told they are, or who they've been told they are for their whole lives, or their lives up to this point. It's hard to break out of that kind of prison of the mind. I think it's she recognizes and points out some rather insidious aspects of South African language in this poem. So the next stanza is probably going to be the most significant to me as a male South African, white Anglo-Saxon male, I suppose. What is it, I ask you, when a boy becomes a man in this country? What defines the difference between boyhood and manhood for somebody like me? Employment, okay. In which case I became a man at the age of 16, I guess. Somebody said to me today, when you lose your virginity, so Renee, what sort of responsibility? Okay. There was this old adage, I don't know where it came from, but A boy becomes a man when his father tells him he is a man. Raising kids, caring for a wife. Okay. So in which case, I only become a man close to 30 years old. My point of the question is it's difficult to define for, let's just say, Western people, people from a Eurocentric background. At what point do you become a man? But in South African tribal culture, it's very different. That masculinity and manhood is something that is valued on a level that I wouldn't necessarily experience in my culture. I would say when you started wearing long pants, so grade 8, then. Some boys become men at early ages. Here's the kind of trick question or the loaded question. What, for example, does it take for a Xhosa man to become a man? How do they transition from boy to man? Thank you, Chantal. Mm-hmm. The cut, I think it's called. So, in the past, and I won't be able to sort of lay down exact dates, but before the government and the mindset we have about it now, when boys went off to circumcision school or initiation, they would all march off with their blanket and their food bowl, and they would submit themselves to the cut. So after being kind of versed in tribal law and traditions, I don't know the term for it, but let's just say a representative of the community would take a razor blade, and each of them would sit on the ground with their legs wide open, and he would grab their foreskin and slice it off with a razor blade. Then, moving on to the next guy, slice, the next guy, slice, and they're not allowed to cry out, they're not allowed to whimper, they're not allowed to shed a tear, they've just got to bear the cut. Yes. So often they didn't come back because hygiene standards were not necessarily what they are today. The blade that would be used would not be sanitized, perhaps. They would get blood poisoning, septicemia, and often they would die as a part of the process. And it was seen as something quite significant if a family's son didn't survive circumcision school because he wasn't enough, he wasn't strong enough to be a man. Those boys who came back, they were men. They'd gone through something as men together that was very harrowing, very trying, very painful. Even involves a degree of, I think, what's the right word? It's not exposure, like, but they are exposed to the elements for a lot of the time. They've got to live very basic lives while they're away. There's tales of families opening up their doors in the morning only to find the blanket and bowl of their son lying on their doorstep. The son didn't make it through circumcision school. The shame that comes with that is supposed to be quite significant. Your child was not man enough to make it through. So now, if you think you come from a cultural tradition like this, and I suppose simplifying it quite a lot. There's a lot more that goes into it, but a young man has gone through this process. He becomes a man in the eyes of his community. He is allowed to marry. He is allowed to go off and work and provide for the family, have a family of his own. And you think about the language that's so embedded in our in the lexicon of apartheid, calling men, black men, boys, the garden boy. That's something that I don't think I'll ever be able to forget this notion of thinking, well, why do we call him boy? Because he's older than you, Dad, and obviously there's no right or rational response. But now, if you take somebody who's been through something like that, and you use that language over and over and over, boy, 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 call the boy the garden boy, it's terrible, but it's very patronizing language, and it keeps people, after a while, after a long, long time, I suppose, in this kind of position in relation to an oppressor. Yes. If you're told as well, if you're told over and over and over on some level, you're inferior, you're stupid, you're less than me, at some point it begins to break your spirit, especially when there's nothing that you can do to really resist it. So I think that line in the poem is so, it hits me between the eyes every time I read it, because if I'm making the correct inferences, she's really identified something that is significantly wrong with the language of the time. So she goes on to, sorry to jump ahead and to get off my kind of ramble there, but in the next stanza she says, "Say no when they rape your daughter in detention and call her a whore." So detention without prosecution. I'm losing the language here a little bit, but the notion that people could be detained for a relatively indefinite period of time without a hearing was quite common during the apartheid era. And what happens in those cells is quite demonic in many instances. We all know what happened to Steve Biko, but what happens to women in those circumstances often is that they will be raped, because that is something that happens in this country. But when it becomes a political tool, as a way of breaking people's spirits, it becomes that much more insidious. Afterwards, when her reputation is ruined or tainted by what happened to her, because people will make sure that the community knows what happened to her, that this is what awaits you if you get arrested. When they rape your daughter in detention and call her a whore, what that might do to the psyche of that daughter, what that might do to the psyche of that woman, and the part of her spirit that might break when something like that happens. And of course, in every stanza, she calls to resist these actions. She calls out these actions, these terrible things, and terrible habits and behaviors in society at the time. And she says, "Say no, don't let it happen." The next two stanzas have a common theme: when they call your white sister a madam, and when they call your white brother a boss. So she's saying, she's using the terminology that many of us are familiar with, that implies, again, this hierarchy, this superiority and inferiority binary in the history of South Africa. Don't let them call your white sister a madam. She is your equal. That's why she says white sister. She is the same as you. She's on the same level as you. When they call your white brother a boss, don't let that happen. Don't let them make you call him boss. He is the same as you. He is equal to you. And that's quite a lovely statement in that stanza. Those of you from Durban, or who have spent time in Durban or know the history at least, say no black woman, say no when they call a trade unionist a terrorist. So we know that the trade unions in South Africa have been a driving force for social change, sometimes for the better, sometimes not so much for the better. But as a kind of, I think, communist-inspired movement, the trade unions represented quite a significant threat to the power and authority of the government, when they could call out their members on strike whenever they wanted. It's a huge chunk of the workforce that you can take away from the means of production. So to call those actions, those industrial actions, terrorist acts, enables the authorities of the time to respond to them as terrorist acts and with violence. For some reason, the more recent case in the last sort of decade of the Marikana miners massacre is coming to mind. This response that should be relatively peaceful can become quite violent quite quickly if you phrase it as something that is threatening, as something that is a terrorist act rather than a protest action. So her last stanza here: say no, black woman, say no when they give you a back seat in the liberation wagon. Say no. Yes, black woman, a big no. So she changes the rather formulaic use of her repetition in the last stanza to address specifically black women and their position in the resistance against apartheid. When they give you a back seat in the liberation wagon, or in liberation wagon, that back of the bus language, does anybody know where that draws from, what the implication might be. Another black woman. Yeah, but who was it that was supposed to sit on the back of the bus but decided they wouldn't sit on the back of the bus, would sit at the front? Yeah. This back of the bus kind of language, I think, is meant to invoke memories of Rosa Parks' act of resistance against segregated spacing on buses in the States. And because she says black woman in particular, it implies to me, maybe I'm reaching too much, but it implies to me that she is aware that black women are not necessarily given as much voice in the protest against or the fight against apartheid as black men. When they give you a back seat in the liberation wagon, they, for me, implies that people who have control over the liberation acts, people who have control over the protest actions. Lively, Hunter, lively. Cool. Again, quite simplistic wording. This whole poem isn't very complicated. It isn't peppered with too much figurative language. It is quite contextual, so you would need to know what a tsotsi is. You would need to have some understanding of the cultural rights and conditions of manhood. Yeah, I think it's more likely, and I think it's more likely because, of course, poetry is interpretive. Is that she's more likely leaning into the Rosa Parks imagery than Gandhi. Cool. So again, a differential use of repetition. Banabai uses the double statement in order to create dual meanings. So his repetition seems to serve one focus or purpose. Focus, I nearly said. And Mhlope's use of repetition has a slightly different effect. It has this rhythmic chanting quality to it. Very simple refrain, say no. A very definite statement of resistance. Okie dokie, artichoke. I'm going to bring up Still I Rise. I don't know how many of you have your seasons come to pass, so I'm just going to grab the file on my PDF here. Give me a second. I'm not very good at multitasking, as you can hear. Wake up, computer. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I'm just going to share that screen. When you give me the thumbs up that you can see it on your side, I will go ahead and go through it. Actually, you know what? Sorry, I'm just going to shuffle it to my other screen here so that I can see your comments as I read if we need to stop. There you go. Okay, so those of you who have your seasons come to pass, you'll see that there is some context about Maya Angelou. Seasons come to pass is, I think, it's quite old now as a text, but yeah, page 200. It is, as I say, yeah, a little bit outdated. So I think Maya Angelou was still alive when this was published, but I think she has passed since. All right. So can I just get a thumbs up if you guys are familiar with this poem? It's one of the more publicized poems in history. So the answer would be surprising if you hadn't heard it. Okay, cool. So I'm going to read through it, if you'll bear with me, and just do my best to highlight or accent what she says in it. Right, so just, Jeanne, to give you some background here, she is one of the most kind of outspoken voices of Black power and Black empowerment. You'll see at the top of the page there, let me just highlight it here. She was sexually abused as a child by a family friend, experience which left her mute and unable to speak for many years. So this is, excuse me, as far as I know, was repeated and was quite, quite traumatic. It sounds really silly saying it like that, but was traumatizing enough to have her mute. So the fact that you can find videos of her reading this poem with like absolute joy in her heart really speaks to the power of language and the fact that she was able to regain her voice, which is a statement of resistance in itself against the person who perpetrated against her. So there's the poem is packed full of themes and imagery. I'm going to do my best to get through them before load shedding kills me, but we can always pick up from it next week if we don't get through it enough. So, Maya Angelou's Still I Rise. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? Because I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like moons and like suns with the certainty of tides, just like hope springing high, still I'll rise. Did you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries? Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard, because I laugh like I've got gold mines digging in my own backyard. You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise. Does my sexiness upset you? Does it come as a surprise that I dance like I've got diamonds at the meeting of my thighs? Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise up from a past that's rooted in pain. I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. Yeah, the poems tend to be about quite significant issues. That's why they've been chosen for resistance poetry, because they are acts of resistance against wrongs, I suppose. Okay, so you should be able to note that Angelou's use of repetition is quite varied. She focuses around the theme and the wording of I rise or I'll rise, but you'll see that it's not consistent. It's not the same in every stanza. Some stanzas don't even have it. Once she appears to be finished with a theme or has identified a theme, she'll use I rise. So there are multiple instances that she speaks about that imply, I suppose, different issues or different concerns that she's dealt with. Okay, so the first stanza: you may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust I'll rise. I feel like she's speaking about the fact that people might not necessarily find a person, especially a black person and a black woman, who speaks out against the wrongfulness of racism and segregation. So they might try and paint her in a light that is unfavorable, is demonizing. She says, but still like dust I'll rise. I love the way she connects that to the previous line in line 4 there. You may trod me in the very dirt. You can think of a boot like slamming down into the dust, and this talcum dust kind of rising around it. There's nothing you can do to stop that. You can't like pat it down because it'll just make more dust rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? Because I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room. So she uses these common images of wealth, the oil wells, the gold mines, and the diamonds, in order to imply how valuable she feels to herself, how she comports herself and composes herself in order to behave, like she's the richest person on earth. So, does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? This is a second person narrative. So she references herself as the speaker, and then the you is the subject. So she's addressing, I think, multiple different subjects, but it's a very personal dialogue, I and you. She uses this lovely natural imagery. So just like moons and like suns, and with the certainty of tides, just like hopes springing high, still I'll rise. Poets use natural imagery in order to invoke something very clear and specific in their audience. People know what the moon and the sun is. We know that they are great, significant natural forces. They are very powerful natural forces, and they are unstoppable, unadjustable. With the certainty of tides, again, we know that tides rise and fall according to a very predictable framework. She is saying that she is that reliable, she is that powerful, she's that natural. Do you want to see me broken? Bowed head with lowered eyes. You can hear like the cynical tone in these lines. Shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries. One of the YouTube readings I have, she even like pretends to sob, and her shoulders shake. She goes, weakened by my soulful cries. Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard, because I laugh like I've got gold mines digging in my own backyard. Again, she's pulling on these significant symbols of wealth, the oil, the gold mines, and the diamonds, in order to speak about how rich she feels, how powerful and empowered she feels, as though she had gold mines digging in her own backyard. The next stanza, you. She's talking about people that have oppressed her, people have hurt her in the past. You may shoot me with your words. This is violent language. The lexical relationship of violence here is significant. So a lexical relationship is when you have a grouping of words that share a similar or common theme, like natural imagery that's still highlighted there. The lexical relationship is one of natural references, so moon, stars, suns, earth, trees, etc. But here we have this these words that share the lexical relationship of violence. You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise. I think she references personal violence that she's experienced, but also recognizing that no matter what people try to impose on her, no matter what sort of violence people would want to visit on her, she will overcome. This stanza, sorry, going back there, the next one with the reference to diamonds. I'll never forget reading this poem the first time and blushing, because I'm a very visual person. Does my sexiness upset you? Does it come as a surprise that I dance like I've got diamonds at the meeting of my thighs? For a woman who has had this history of violent sexual assault and abuse to the point where she was mute for years, draw our attention to her sexuality and to almost encrust her own groin. Then repeated right back at me. That's weird. Really says how much she values her sexuality. Really says that she's not ashamed of it. In fact, she values it so highly that she chooses not oil, not gold, but diamonds to represent her sexuality. The ostensibly most valuable substance on earth lives at the meeting of her thighs. And I think that's quite a bold statement and quite a strong and powerful statement about her own sexuality. Okay, I want to ask you what you think of this line: out of the huts of history, shame, I'll rise. What are the huts of history, shame? Yeah. I think the choice of words is interesting in the line. Out of the huts of history, shame. So why I say it's interesting to me is that there's often an assumption about the West African slave trade that starts, or sorry, I should say, an idea of the West African slave trade that starts on the coast before people are put onto ships and packed like sardines across the middle passage of the Atlantic to the Caribbean or to what is now the United States or even to Britain. But they get to those slave pens not usually by the force of the European slavers or the American slavers. Yeah, who gets where I'm going with this? That often tribes would war with each other and they would go on raiding missions to collect slaves to be sold. So one tribe would capture another tribe or another group of people, slap them in ropes and irons and march them to the coast to sell them to the slavers. And that's often something that's overlooked in the narrative of slavery, is that Black Africans were selling each other into slavery as part of the kind of enterprise of slavery. And it's something that jumps out at me when I see that line, out of the huts of history, shame, because she's acknowledging that there is some shame to be had historically because Black people slave traded. Not to say that it, you know, takes away responsibility or any kind of guilt from white slave traders, but that she's maybe acknowledging that there are more aspects to this than initially meet the eye. An inconvenient truth, yeah. There's a movie on Netflix. I don't know what it's called. I think the Woman King, something like that, at the moment, that deals with one of the tribes that actually slave traded their own people. But I haven't watched it yet. I've just seen some of the reviews that note that they don't actually deal with the slave trade at all. It's quite a, I don't know, misaligned narrative. Anyway, so you'll see like under each of these stanzas where she's feeling powerful, she states I'll rise in a different form. Still I'll rise, but still like air I'll rise. And here as we get to the last sort of statement, out of the huts of history shame I rise, up from a past that's rooted in pain I rise. Here's this beautiful natural imagery again. I'm a black ocean leaping and wide. Something again very big and powerful. We've had moon, we've had tide, we've had sun, and now she's an ocean. Again, something incomprehensibly powerful. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. For me, this is a reach back or a reference to her own sexual assault and abuse. The nights of terror and fear, I rise into a daybreak that's wondrously clear. I rise. Leaving behind that dark imagery and walking forward into a life that's beautiful and is hers. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. When you see her standing on stage in front of this massive audience, reading this poem, or reciting this poem, I should say, not reading it, this sense of accomplishment and freedom that is connected to the sacrifice of her predecessors, of the slaves that landed on the coast, that are her ancestors, I think is the word I'm getting to, that she's acknowledging what they would have wanted. That kind of freedom that she experiences is something that they died for. And I think it's a lovely way to acknowledge their sacrifice. And just this continuous, this repetition. I rise, I rise, I rise. The video I'm thinking of, she kind of like slaps her hands in the air and points off into the sky with that last statement. I'll find the link and I'll put it on the WhatsApp group for you guys if you want to have a look. Okay, so the notion of rising is what's repeated here, not necessarily the exact language, not exactly the same line every time, but the fact that she rises, that's repeated, that's consistent. You cannot put her down. You cannot keep her down because she'll rise. So, repetition in another resistance poem used in a different way from Mflobe and from Bonabai. Look at my time. I have 2 minutes before the power goes out. Any quick questions or comments, anyone? You see so much with this, so much emotion and tragedy, fight to victory, and coming to nothing. Great. I'm glad you take something significant from it. Please, for next week, make sure that you read through Cole and Letter from a Contract Worker. There we go. Okay, so we're having a look at the significant use of imagery in resistance poetry between Cole and Letter from a Contract Worker. And then we will have done 5 out of the 7, and we'll only have 1 more context session in order really to get through, let's see, I'm in Danger, Sir, and the Weaver Bird. So if there are no questions, I hope it wasn't too condensed. The recording is recording. I'm going to stop the recording now so that it's got a chance to start consolidating online. I'm in